Hello everyone, and welcome back to another fairy tale reading. This week we will be reading The Little Mermaid. Far out at sea, the water is as blue as the bluest cornflower, and as clear as the clearest crystal, but it is very deep, deeper than any anchor cable can fathom. Many church steeples would have to be piled on top of each other to reach the very bottom to the surface of the water. And down in those depths live the sea folk. Now, don't imagine for a moment that there's nothing but bare white sand on the bed of the ocean. No, no, no. There are the most fantastic trees and flowers growing there, and all kinds of fishes, big and small, flitting in and out among the branches, just as birds do in the air up here. At the very lowest depths stand the palace of the Sea King. The walls are made of coral, and the high, pointed windows of the clearest amber. But the roof is made of mussel shells, which open and close with the gentle motions of the water. It is a wonderful sight, for every mussel shell contains gleaming pearls. Any single one would be the perfect ornament for a queen's crown. The Sea King had been a widower for many years, but his old mother kept house for him. She was intelligent, although proud of her noble birth, and that is why she went about with 12 oysters on her tail, when other high-born ladies are allowed just 6. Apart from this, she deserved a great deal of praise because she was so fond of her grandchildren, the princesses. They were 6 beautiful little girls, and the youngest was the prettiest of them all. Her skin was clear and delicate as a rose petal. Her eyes were as blue as the deepest sea, but, like the other mermaids, she had no feet, only a fish's tail. All day long they used to play down in the palace, in the great galleries where living flowers grew out of the walls. When the tall amber windows were opened, swarms of fishes swam in, just as swallows fly into our rooms when we open the windows. But these fishes swam right up to the little princesses, ate from their hands, and allowed themselves to be patted. Outside the palace there was a large garden with trees of fiery red and deep blue, their fruits glimmering like gold, and flowers like a blazing fire, ceaselessly moving in their stems. The ground itself was the finest sand, but blue as a sulphur flame. Down there, a strange blue mist enveloped everything. You would have thought you were standing high in the air, with only the sky above and beneath you, and not down at the depths of the ocean. When the surface is dead calm, you could just faintly perceive the sun, looking like a crimson flower from which streamed a flood of light. Each of the small princesses had her own little plot in the garden where she could dig and plant as she liked. One of them gave her flower bed the shape of a whale. Another thought it nicer to have hers formed like a mermaid. But the youngest made hers as round as the sun, and used only flowers as red as the sun itself. She was a strange child, quiet and pensive, and, while the other sisters decorated their gardens with all kinds of extraordinary things that they had taken from sunken ships, she would have nothing in hers but a beautiful statue and her red flowers. It was the statue of a handsome boy, of the purest white marble, that had sunken to the bottom of the sea after a shipwreck. Next to the statue, she planted a rose-red weeping willow, which grew splendidly, and shaded the statue with its delicate branches. Oh, nothing gave the youngest princess greater pleasure than to hear about the world of human beings up above. She made her grandmother tell her all that she knew about ships and towns and people and animals. But what fascinated her beyond words was the flowers on the earth and and that they were scented, while those at the bottom of the sea were not. That the woods were green, and that the fishes one saw amongst the branches could sing so loudly and sweetly that it was a delight to hear them. Grandmother, of course, called these the little birds of the air fishes, otherwise mermaids would not have understood her, for no bird could live at the bottom of the ocean. "As soon as you are 15," said their grandmother, you will all be allowed to rise up above the water and sit on the rocks in the moonlight to watch the big ships sail by." The following year, the eldest sister was to have her 15th birthday. But there was 1 year between each of them, and the youngest still had 5 whole years to wait before her turn came to see what things are like on the earth. And the very one who had the longest time to wait was, of course, the most curious of them all. Many a night she stood by the open window and looked up through the dark blue sea, where the fishes were lashing in the water with their fins and tails. She could just barely perceive the moon and stars, though their light was very faint. Of course, through the water they looked much bigger than they do to us, as if something like a black cloud passed under them. And she knew that it was either a whale swimming above her, or a ship with many people on board. They probably never dreamed that a lovely little mermaid was standing below, raising her white hands towards the keel of the ship, wishing she could see it. The eldest princess had now reached 15 and was allowed to rise above the surface. When she came back, she had hundreds of things to tell the others. But the most wonderful of all, she said, was to lie in the moonlight on a sandbank in the calm sea, gazing at the huge town close to the shore, where the lights twinkled like hundreds of stars, to listen to the music and the church bells, and to the noise and stir of carriages and people. But just because she could not get there, that was the very thing the mermaid longed to do most of all. Oh, how eagerly she listened! And whenever after this she stood at the open window in the evening and looked up through the blue sea, she thought of the great town with its noise and bustle, and seemed to hear the sound of church bells coming right down to her. The following year, the second sister was allowed to rise through the waves. She reached the surface just at sunset, and that sight was the most magnificent she had ever seen. The heavens looked as though they were painted liquid gold, she told them, and the clouds, oh, well, she never tired of describing their beauty, all rosy red and violet as they sailed over her, faster than clouds, though. Like a long white veil flung out towards the sky, a flock of wild swans flew away over the water beyond which the sun was setting. She swam towards the sun, but it sank, and the rosy tint faded away from the sea. The year after, the third sister went up. She was the most daring of them all, so she swam up the broad river which flowed into the ocean. She saw beautiful green hills and vineyards, palaces and farms were faintly visible among the splendid forest. In a tiny cove, she found a crowd of little children, splashing and playing in the water. She wanted to play too, but she gave them a fright, and they ran away. Then came a little black animal. It was a dog, but she had never seen one before, and it barked at her so ferociously that she was frightened and took refuge in the open sea. But she would never forget the beautiful woods, the green hills, and the lovely children who could swim in the water even with no fish's tails. The fourth sister was not so daring. She remained far out in the stormy ocean and told her sister that staying there was the best part of her adventure. You could see for miles and miles around, and the sky above was like a great glass dome. She had seen ships, but only far, far away. They looked as small as seagulls. The amusing dolphins had turned somersaults, and the gigantic whales had spouted water through their nostrils, giving the effect of 100 fountains playing. Now it was the time for the fifth sister. Her birthday happened to be in the winter, so she saw things which none of the others had seen when they first went up to the surface. The sea was quite green, and large icebergs were floating about. They looked like pearls, she said. They appeared in the most wonderful shapes and sparkled like diamonds. She sat down on one of the largest, and every ship gave it a wide berth when the sailors saw her sitting there, with her long hair floating out in the wind. Late in the evening, the sky became overcast. Thunder crashed, and lightning stabbed the sky, while the black waves lifted the huge icebergs high up on their crests. Sails were furled on all the ships, and the sailors stood in fear, trembling. But she sat quietly on her floating iceberg and watched the blue lightning flash in zigzags down into the shining sea. The first time the sisters rose above the water, they were all delighted with the new and beautiful things that they had seen, but now they were grown up, and they were allowed to go to the surface whenever they liked. So they lost interest in it. They longed for their home, and after a month had gone by, each said that no place was more delightful than the bottom of the sea. Besides, one felt so comfortably at home there. Many an evening, the five sisters would appear on the surface arm in arm. They had beautiful voices, more beautiful than those of any human being, and when storms threatened to wreck the ships, the mermaids would swim in front of them. They sang their most seductive songs of the wonders of the depths of the sea, and tried to persuade the people not to be afraid of coming down to them. But the seafarers could not understand them. They thought it was the storm they heard, nor did they ever see the promised splendor, for when ships sank, they drowned, and no man had ever reached the palace of the Sea King alive. That night, when the sisters rose up through the water, the youngest remained quite alone, gazing after them. She would have wept, but a mermaid has no tears, and so she suffers all the more. "Oh, that I were 15," she said. "I know I shall love the upper world." But before she knew it, she too reached the age of 15. "Well, now we are getting you off our hands," said her grandmother, the old queen. "Come here, let me dress you up like your sisters." And she put a wreath of white lilies on her head, but each petal was formed a half pearl. Then the old queen made 8 large oysters fasten themselves to the princess' tail to show her high rank. "Oh, it hurts," said the little mermaid. "Well, one must suffer to be beautiful," declared her grandmother. The little mermaid would have gladly shaken off all this finery and laid it aside the heavy wreath. The red flowers in her garden suited her much better, but she did not dare to change. "Goodbye, goodbye," she said, as she rose up through the waters. The sun had just set when her head appeared above the surface, but the clouds were still tinted with rose and gold, and the pink flushed sky, the evening star, it all twinkled bright and clear. The air was mild and fresh, and the sea was calm. She saw a 3-masted ship with only a single sail set, for not a breath of wind stirred, and the sailors were sitting on the rigging. She heard music and singing on board the ship, and as the darkness was gathering, Hundreds of colored lanterns were lighted, and they looked like the flags of every nation waving in the air. The little mermaid swam right up to the porthole of the cabin, and every time the swell lifted her, she would see crowds of people in evening dress. But her eye was caught by the most handsome of them all, a young prince with great coal black eyes. He could have been hardly more than 16 years old himself. It was his birthday, and that was the reason for the party. The sailors danced on the deck, and when the prince appeared among them, hundreds of rockets flew up into the air, turning the night to day and frightening the little mermaid so much that she dived under the water. But she soon ventured her head up again, and it looked as though the stars were falling from the sky. Never had she seen such a display. It was so light on board the ship one could see every rope, to say nothing of the people. Oh, how handsome the young prince was, laughing and smiling while the music rang out in the beauty of that night. It got quite late, but the little mermaid could not turn her eyes away from the ship, nor the beautiful prince. The colored lanterns were put out, no more rockets shot up into the air, no more guns were fired, but deep down in the sea there was a dull hammering and rumbling. The water lifted her up and down so that she could look into the cabin, but the ship started to move. Sail after sail opened to the wind, and the waves grew mightier. Great clouds gathered, and lightning flashed along the horizon. Oh, there was a terrible weather ahead, so the sailors furled the sails. The great ship plowed on, pitching and tossing in the angry sea. Waves, like enormous black mountains, were threatening to crash down upon the mast. The ship disappeared like a swan in the trough of the waves, and was lifted again the next moment to the top of their towering crests. The ship creaked and groaned. The thick planks cracked under the blows of the waves. Then the mast broke in two like a reed, and the ship rolled over so far to one side that the water rushed into its hold. And when that happened, the little mermaid saw that the people were in peril, while she herself had to beware of the beams and the pieces of wreckage which were floating about in the sea. At one moment it was pitch dark, and she could see nothing at all. Then there came a flash of lightning, which lit up everything on board. Throughout the wreckage of the ship, she looked particularly for the young prince, and when the ship split in two, she saw him sink into the sea. Her first impulse was one of joy, because he was coming to her. But then she remembered that human beings could not live under the water, and he would not come alive down to her father's place. Oh, die he must not, no. So she swam in amongst the drifting beams and planks, quite forgetting that they might crush her. She dived deep into the sea, rose up high again among the waves, and at last reached the young prince, who could hardly keep on swimming in the stormy ocean. His arms and legs were beginning to fail him, and his beautiful eyes were closing, and he would have died had not the little mermaid been there. She held his head above the water and let the waves carry her with him wherever they pleased. At dawn, the storm was over. Not a trace of the ship was to be seen. The sun rose red and shining out of the water and seemed to bring life and color back into the prince's cheeks. But his eyes remained closed. The mermaid kissed his high, noble brow and stroked back his wet hair. She thought he looked like the marble statue down in her garden. She kissed him again and wished from the bottom of her heart that he might live. In front of her, she saw land, with snow-capped mountains in the distance. Near the shoreline were glorious green forests, and close by was a church, or a convent. She could not be certain just what it was. Lemon and orange trees grew in the garden, and outside the gate were tall palm trees. There the sea had formed a cove where the white sand had been washed up. She swam towards it with the handsome prince, and laid him on the sand with his head turned towards the warm rays of the sun. Then the bells rang out from the white building, and a group of young girls came through the garden. The little mermaid swam farther out and hid behind some large rocks, covering her hair and her chest with sea foam so that no one could catch sight of her face, and then kept watch to see who would come to rescue the poor shipwrecked prince. It was not long before the young girls arrived. For a moment they seemed quite frightened, but they ran for help, and the mermaid saw the prince come to and smile at those who stood around him. But he did not smile at her far out in the sea, for he did not know that she had saved him. She felt very sad, and when he was carried into the great building, she dived sorrowfully down to the depths of the water and returned to her father's palace. There her sisters asked what she had seen on her first visit to the surface, but she would tell them nothing. Many an evening and many a morning she rose up to the place where she had left the prince. She saw how the fruit in the garden ripened and was gathered, how snow melted on distant mountains, but she never again saw the prince. So she would return home sadder than before. Her only consolation was to sit in her little garden and throw her arms around the beautiful marble statue which looked so much like him. She neglected her flowers, and they grew into a wilderness over all the paths and wove their long stems and leaves in the branches of the trees until the whole place was shrouded in darkness. When she could no longer endure it, she confided in one of her sisters. At once the others knew about it, but no one else, except for a few more mermaids, which told just their most intimate friends. One of them knew who the prince was. She too had seen the party held in his honor, and had heard where his kingdom lay. "Come, little sister," said the other princesses, and with their arms around each other's shoulders, they rose in a long line through the water opposite the place where they knew the prince's palace stood. It was a great building of pale yellow stone, with a great flight of marble steps leading down to the sea. Splendid gilded cupolas could be seen above the roof, and in between the pillars surrounding the whole building stood marble statues which looked as though they were alive. Through the clear glass windows one looked to magnificent halls where costly silk curtains and tapestries were hung, and where all the walls were covered with large paintings. In the middle of the biggest hall, a great fountain was playing, its jets soaring high up towards the glass dome through which the sun shone. And that sun shone down upon the water and upon the beautiful plants growing in the basin. Now that she knew where he lived, many an evening and many a night she haunted the place. She swam much closer to land than any of her sisters had dared to do, and she even went up the narrow creek running under the splendid balcony which cast its long shadow upon the water. Here she would sit and gaze at the young prince, who thought himself quite alone in the bright moonlight. Often in the evening she saw him sailing to the sound of music in a splendid new ship with waving flags. She peeped through the reeds, and if the wind caught her silver white veil, those who saw it thought it was a swan spreading its wings. Many a night she heard the fisherman praising the young prince, and she rejoiced that she had saved his life. She thought how closely his head had rested on hers, and how lovingly she had kissed his forehead, though he knew nothing of it and could not even dream of her. She slowly became more and more fond of human beings, and more did she long to be among them. Their world seemed so much larger than her own. They were able to fly over the sea in ships and climb lofty mountains. The lands they possessed stretched farther than her eyes could reach. There was so much she wanted to know. But her sisters could not answer all her questions, so when she asked her old grandmother, who knew so much of the upper world, as she rightly called the countries above the sea, if humans aren't drowned, asked the little mermaid, do they live forever? Or don't they die as we do down in the depths of the sea? Oh, yes, answered the old lady. They must die too, and their lifetime is even shorter than ours. We can live to be 300 years old, but when we cease to exist, we turn to foam on the water, so we don't even have a grave down here among our dear ones. We have no mortal soul. We never have another life. We are like the green reed. Once it is cut, it never grows again. Human beings, on the contrary, have a soul which lives forever, which lives after their body has turned to dust. It rises up through the air, up to the shining stars. Just as we rise out of the water and see beautiful countries of the earth, so do they rise up to beautiful regions unknown, which we shall never be able to see. Why are we not granted an immortal soul? Asked the little mermaid in a melancholy voice. I know I would gladly give the 300 years I have if I could only be a human being for a single day, and then have some part of that heavenly world. You must not brood over that, said her grandmother. We have a much happier life than the people up there. So I am fated to die and float up like foam upon the sea? Can I do nothing to win an immortal soul? No, said the old lady. That could only happen if a human being held you so dear that you were more to him than any father or mother, if he loved you with all his heart and soul, and if his right hand were joined by yours in marriage, with a promise to be faithful to you, here and for all eternity. Then part of his soul would pass into your body, and you would have a share of the happiness of mankind. He would give you a soul and yet retain his own. But that can never happen. The very thing that is considered so beautiful down here, your fish's tail, is considered ugly upon the earth. People have very poor judgment indeed. They have two clumsy supports, which they call legs, and think them beautiful. Then the little mermaid sighed, and looked sadly at her fish's tail. Come, let us be happy, said her grandmother. Let us leap and jump about during the 300 years that we have. Seems a fair enough amount of time. After that we can rest the more merrily. Tonight we are going to a court ball. A court ball under the sea is a truly magnificent affair, such as one never sees on earth. The walls and ceiling of the great ballroom were made with thick, transparent glass. In rows on each side stood hundreds of gigantic shells, rose red and grass green, a blue fire burning in each. They lit up the entire room, and shining through the walls, lit up the sea as well. Innumerable fishes, great and small, could be seen swimming near the glass walls. Some had scales gleaming scarlet, while others shone just like silver and gold. Down through the middle of the hall flowed a broad stream, on which the mermen and mermaids danced their own beautiful singing. No voices such as theirs are ever heard among the people of earth. The little mermaid sang more beautifully than anyone else. Everyone applauded her, and for a moment her heart was filled with joy, for she had the loveliest voice of all, on earth and in the sea. But she could not forget the handsome prince that she would not share it with, nor her sorrow at not having an immortal soul. So she stole out of her father's palace, and, while everything else was in joy and gaiety, sat sadly in her little garden. Suddenly, she heard horns sounding down through the water, and she thought, "He is sailing up there, he who I love more than my father and my grandmother, he to whom all my thoughts are clinging, and in whose hand I would gladly place the happiness of my life. I would risk everything in my world to win him and an immortal soul. While my sisters are dancing in my father's palace, I shall go to the old sea witch. She has always terrified me, but perhaps now she can advise and help me." So she left her garden and set out towards the roaring whirlpools, for beyond them lived the witch. The little mermaid had never been that way before. No flowers grew there, only the bare, gray, sandy bottom stretched as far as the whirlpools which swirled around like roaring mill wheels, sweeping everything within reach down into the fathomless sea. She had to pass right through those crushing, swirling waters to enter the territory of the sea witch. Then, for a long way, the only road went over a hot, bubbling morass. Her peat bog, the witch had called it. Behind it lay her house, in the midst of a strange-looking forest. All the trees and bushes were polyps, half animal and half plant. They looked like 100-headed snakes growing out of the ground. Their branches were long, slimy arms with slithering, worm-like fingers, moving joint by joint from the root to the very tip. They twined around anything they could reach, never loosening their grip. Terror-stricken, the little mermaid stopped at the edge of this forest. Her heart beat faster with fear, and she almost turned back. But then she thought of the prince and of the human soul, and her courage returned. She bound her long, flowing hair tightly around her head, so that the polyps might not seize her by it, and she folded her arms closely across her chest, and darted as a fish darts through the water, in among the hideous polyps, which stretched out their supple arms and fingers to catch her. She saw how each of them clung tightly to something it had caught. People who had perished at sea and sunk down deep at the bottom were visible as human bones amongst the arms of the polyps. The polyps also clutched ships' rudders, sea chests, and skeletons of land animals, and, most horribly, she even saw a little mermaid whom they had caught and strangled. She next came to a great slimy clearing in the forest, where big, fat water snakes writhed and rolled, showing their yellowish white bellies. In the center of the clearing was a house built of bones of shipwrecked men. There sat the sea witch, letting a toad feed out of her mouth the exact way we let a canary eat sugar. She called the hideous fat water snakes her little chickens, and let them creep and crawl all over her spongy body.
"I know what it is you want," said the witch. "It is very foolish of you, for it will bring trouble upon you, my pretty one. But all the same, you shall have your way. You want to get rid of your beautiful fish's tail and have those two bits of stump to walk with instead, like people on earth. So your young prince will fall in love with you, and you will win both him and immortal soul."
There the witch let out a laugh so loud and ghastly that the toads and snakes that she had been loving tumbled down to the ground, where they lay wallowing about.
"You have come just in time," said the witch. "Had you waited till sunrise tomorrow, I could not have helped you for a whole year. But I'm going to brew a potion for you. Before the sun rises, you must swim to the land with it, sit down on the shore, and drink it. Then your tail will part in two and shrink to what the people on earth call pretty legs. But it will hurt as if a sharp sword were cutting through you. Everybody who sees you will say that you are the prettiest human being they have ever seen. You are to keep your gliding motion, for no dancer will be able to move as gracefully as you. But every step it will feel as though you are treading on a sharp-edged knife, so sharp that your feet seem to be bleeding." She paused for a moment, then went on. "If you are strong enough to bear all this, I shall be able to help you." "I can," said the little mermaid in a quivering voice, as she fixed her thought of the prince and winning an immortal soul. But remember, once you have taken human shape, you can never become a mermaid again. You can never return to your father's palace, and if you do not win the love of the prince, so that for your sake he forgets both father and mother and clings to you with heart and soul and lets you be joined in marriage, making you man and wife, then you will not win immortal soul. On the morning he marries someone else, your heart will break and you will die, becoming the foam of the sea."
I am willing," said the little mermaid, who was as pale as death itself.
"Oh, but you will also have to pay me," said the witch, "and it is not a trifle that I require. You have the most beautiful voice of anyone down here in the depths of the sea. You think that you will be able to charm the prince with it, but you must give me that voice. I want the best thing you possess in exchange for my precious potion. I must drop some of my own blood into it, so that the draught may be as sharp as a two-edged sword."
"But if I let you take my voice, what shall I have left?"
"You'll have your beautiful form, your gilding motion, and eloquent eyes. They will be enough for you to beguile any human heart." "Well, have you lost your courage? Put out your tongue, and I will take it as my payment, and you shall have a potion strong enough to give you what you desire." "So be it," said the little mermaid, and the witch put on her cauldron to fire and brew the magic draught. "Cleanliness is a good thing," she said as she scoured the cauldron with snakes she had tied into a knot. Then she made a cut in her finger and let her black blood drip into the cauldron. The witch kept on throwing different ingredients, and when the mixture finally started to bubble, it sounded like a crocodile sobbing. The steam coming from the cauldron shaped itself in the most terrifying and horrible forms. But when the potion was ready, it looked as clear as the clearest water. "There you are," said the witch as she took the tongue of the little mermaid. She had now become mute, and could neither sing nor speak. "If the polyps should clutch you as you make your way back through the forest," said the witch, "just throw a single drop of this draught upon each of them, and the arms and fingers will scatter into 1,000 little tiny pieces." But there was no need for the little mermaid to do that. The polyps shrank back in terror when they saw the shining potion gleaming in her hand like a twinkling star. Thus, she quickly passed through the forest, the bog, and the roaring whirlpools. She could see her father's palace. The torches had extinguished in the great ballroom. Her family were probably all asleep, but she had not the courage to approach them now. Not now that she was mute and leaving them forever. It felt as though her heart were going to break with sorrow. She stole into the garden, picked one flower from each of her sister's flower beds, and blew 1,000 kisses towards her home and rose up through the deep blue sea. It was not yet sunrise when she saw the prince's palace and went up the stately marble steps. The moon was still shining, beautifully clear. The little mermaid drank the sharp, burning draught given her by the witch, and she felt as though a two-edged sword had cut through her beautiful body. She swooned with agony and fainted, laying as if she were dead. When the sun spread its rays over the sea, she awoke and felt a stinging pain. But before her stood the handsome young prince. He fixed his coal-black eyes upon her, and under his gaze she lowered her eyes and saw that her fish's tail was gone, and she had the prettiest pair of white legs as any girl could desire. The prince asked her who she was and how she had come there, and she looked up at him with dark blue eyes, so mild yet full of sadness, for she could not speak. Then he took her by the hand and led her into the palace. As the witch had foretold, she seemed at each step to be treading on sharp knives and pointed daggers, but she bore the pain gladly. Led by the prince, she moved lightly as a bubble, and he and everyone else marveled at her graceful, gliding motion. They clad her in costly robes of silk. She was the fairest of all in the palace, but she was mute and could neither speak nor sing. Beautiful girls, dressed in silk and gold, came before them and sang for the prince and his royal parents. One of them sang more delightfully than the others, and the prince clapped his hands and smiled at her, which saddened the little mermaid, for she knew that she herself used to sing far more beautifully. "Oh, if only he knew I gave away my voice forever to be with him," The girls now danced gracefully to the accompaniment of the loveliest music imaginable. And then the little mermaid lifted her pretty white arms and, rising to the tips of her toes, flitted across the floor, dancing as no one had ever danced before. With each of her movements, her beauty seemed more and more evident, and her eyes spoke deeply to the heart, far more deeply than the song of the girls. Everyone was enchanted, especially the prince, who called her his little foundling, and she danced again and again, though every time her foot touched the ground, it seemed as though she were treading upon sharp knives. The prince said that she must always remain with him, and allowed her to sleep in a room near side his. He had a page's dress made for her, so that she might accompany him on horseback. They rode through the fragrant woods, through the green boughs, and her shoulders brushed the woods, and little birds sang hidden among the leaves. She climbed the highest mountains in the kingdom with the prince, and though her delicate feet bled so that even the others in the group noticed it, she only laughed and followed him until they could see the clouds moving far below them like flocks of birds on their way to distant lands. At night, when the others were asleep in the prince's palace, she would go out onto the broad marble steps and cool her burning feet in the cold sea water. And then she would think of her dear ones that she had left behind in the depths of the sea. One night, her sisters appeared, arm in arm, singing mournful songs as they swam along. She beckoned to them, and they recognized her, and told her how much she had grieved them all. They visited the little mermaid almost every night after that, and once, in the far, far distance, she saw her old grandmother, who had not been above the water in many years, and the Sea King himself with his crown upon his head. They stretched out their hands towards her, but did not venture so near the land as her sisters. Day by day she grew dearer to the prince. He loved her as one loves a good child, but he had no thought of making her his queen. Yet his wife she must be, for she could never win an immortal soul, but would become merely a cloud of foam on the sea the morning after he had wed another. Am I not dearer to you than anyone else? Her eyes seemed to ask, when he took her in his arms and kissed her fair brow. Oh, yes, you are the dearest of all to me, said the prince, for you have the kindest heart of all. You are more devoted to me than anyone else, and you look like a young girl whom I once saw, but I shall probably never see again. I was on board a ship which was wrecked. The waves carried me ashore near a holy temple, where a group of young maidens were serving. The youngest of them found me, and she saved my life. I saw her but twice. She is the only one in the world I could ever love. But you look so much like her that you could almost take her place in my heart. After all, she belongs to the holy temple, and therefore destiny sent you to me. We must never part. Alas, he does not know that it is I who saved his life, thought the little mermaid. It is I who carried him over the water to the forest where the temple stands. I stayed hidden in the foam to see if anyone would come. I saw the pretty maiden whom he loves better than me. And she gave a great deep sigh, for a mermaid can shed no tears. The maiden belongs to the holy temple, he tells me. But she will never come out into the world, so they will never meet again. I am with him. I see him every day. I cherish him, love him, and have given up my life to him." But soon it was rumored that the prince was going to marry the beautiful daughter of a neighboring king, and that was why he was fitting out such a splendid ship. They said the prince was paying a state visit to the country of that king, but the real reason was to see the king's daughter. He had a great entourage with him. The little mermaid shook her head and laughed in her heart, for she knew the prince's thoughts far better than anyone else. "I must go away," he said to her. "I must go and see the beautiful princess. My parents insist on it, though fortunately they do not compel me to bring her home as my bride. I cannot love her. She is not like the beautiful maiden in the temple, or as you are. If ever I had to choose a bride, I would sooner choose you, my dear foundling, though mute you are, with sparkling eyes." And he kissed her, playing with her long hair, and lay his forehead against hers, so she dreamed of human happiness and an immortal soul. "I hope you are not afraid of the sea," he said, when they stood upon the splendid ship which was to carry him to the country of the neighboring king. Then he told her of the storm and the calm of sea, and strange fishes in the depths of the ocean, and what divers had seen down there, and she smiled about his description, for she knew more than anyone else of the bottom of the sea. In the moonlit night, when all were asleep except the helmsman at the wheel, she sat by the rail, and, gazing down through the water, she fancied she could see her father's palace. On the top stood her old grandmother in a silver crown upon her head, gazing at the keel of the ship through the fast flowing current. Then her sisters came up above the water, and they looked with deep sorrow in their eyes and wrung their white hands. She beckoned to them, smiling, and tried to make them understand that she was well and happy. But when the cabin boy came towards her, her sisters dived down again, so she felt quite certain the gleam of the white he had seen was nothing but foam. The next morning, the ship sailed into the harbor of the neighboring king's magnificent city. All the church bells rang, and from the tall towers trumpets were blown, and soldiers were standing at attention with flying colors and glittering bayonets. Each day brought new festivity. Balls and parties were given all the time. But the princess had not yet arrived. People said she was being brought up in a holy temple, where she was learning every royal accomplishment. At last, she appeared on the scene. The little mermaid waited anxiously to see her beauty, and she had to admit she had never seen a more graceful form. The princess's skin was fine and delicate, with long dark eyelashes that smiled behind a pair of dark blue eyes, full of mischief and devotion. "It is you! You who saved me when I lay like a corpse on the shore," said the prince, and he clasped his blushing bride-to-be in his arms. "Oh, I am more than happy," he said to the little mermaid. "My dearest wish, the thing I had never hoped for, has been granted to me. You will rejoice in my happiness, for you are more devoted to me than anyone else." Then the little mermaid kissed his hand, but already her heart seemed to be breaking. The morning after his wedding would bring death to her and change her to foam on the sea. All the church bells rang. Heralds rode about the streets and proclaimed the betrothal. On every altar, fragrant oil was burning in costly silver lamps. The priests swung their censers. The bride and bridegroom joined hands to receive the bishop's blessing. The little mermaid, clad in silk and gold, was holding the bride's train. Her ears heard nothing of the festive music, and her eyes saw nothing of the holy ceremony. She thought of the last night she had to live, and all that she had lost in the world. And all this was made worse, for a mermaid can shed no tear. That very evening, bride and bridegroom went on board the ship. Cannons were fired, banners fluttered in the wind, and in the middle of the ship a royal tent of gold and purple was set up, furnished with great cushions on which the bridal couple were to sleep in the calm, cool night. The sails swelled out in the breeze, and the ship glided smoothly without any perceptible motion over the limpid sea. When it grew dark, colored lanterns were lighted, and sailors danced merry dances on the deck. Oh, the little mermaid could not help thinking of the first time she rose to the surface of the sea and saw a similar sight of splendor and joy. Light as a swallow, in full flight, she joined the dance to the sound and cheers of those, and she danced with those she had never danced with before. Her delicate feet seemed to be cut by sharp knives, but the anguish in her heart was so great that she did not feel the pain. She knew only that this was the last evening she would ever see the prince, for whom she had forsaken her people, her home, had given up her beautiful voice to the sea witch, and had daily suffered untold agony, while he remained unaware of it all. The gaiety and merriment lasted long past midnight, and while the little mermaid laughed and danced like the others, the thought of death was in her heart. The prince kissed his beautiful bride, and she played with his black hair, and arm in arm they went into the splendid tent. A hushed silence fell upon the ship. Only the helmsman stood out at the wheel. The little mermaid laid her white arms upon the rail and gazed towards the east, waiting to see the red tinge of the dawn. The first rays of the sun, she knew, would kill her. Then she saw her sisters rising out of the sea. They were pale like herself, but their beautiful long hair no longer fluttered in the wind. It had all been cut off. "We have given it to the witch so that she may give you help and save you from dying before dawn. She has given us a knife. Look, here it is. Do you see its sharp edge? Before the sun rises, you must plunge it into the prince's heart, and then your feet will grow into a fish's tail, and you will become a mermaid again. You will be able to come down with us into the water and live your 300 years before you turn to dead foam. Make haste. Either he or you must die before the sun rises. Our old grandmother has been mourning till her white hair has fallen out, as ours fell under the witch's scissors. Do it quickly and come back. Make haste. Do you not see the red streak in the sky? We only have a few minutes before you die." Having said this, they uttered a deep sigh and disappeared in the waves. The little mermaid took the knife. She drew back the purple curtains of the tent and saw the beautiful bride sleeping with her head on top of the prince's chest. She bent down, kissed him on his fair brow, and then looked up at the sky where the first faint flush of dawn became brighter and brighter. She looked at the sharp knife and again fixed her eyes on the prince, who in his sleep was muttering the name of his bride. She, and only she, was in his thoughts. The knife quavered in the mermaid's hand, but then she flung it far out into the waves. It gleamed red where it fell, as though the drops of blood were bubbling through the water. Once more, she looked with dimming eyes upon the prince, knowing the blood was from sunlight and not from him. Then she threw herself from the ship into the water, and her body dissolved into foam. The sun rose out of the sea. Its rays fell mild and warm upon the death-cold sea foam, and the little mermaid felt not the hand of death. She saw the bright sun, which above her floated hundreds of beautiful, ethereal beings, so transparent that through them she could see the white sails of the ship and the rosy clouds of the sky. Their voices were music, but so unearthly that no living ear could grasp it, just as no living thing could see their forms. Without wings, they floated by their own lightness through the air. The little mermaid saw that she too had a body like theirs, and that it was gradually freeing itself more and more of the foam. "Toward who am I floating?" she asked, and her voice sounded like the others, so ethereal that no earthly music could possibly render it. "To the daughters of the air," the others said. "No mermaid has an immortal soul and can never gain one unless she wins the love of a human being. Her eternal life depends on a power outside herself. The daughters of the air have no immortal souls either, but they can gain one by their good deeds. We fly to the hot countries where torrid air of pestilence kills men. We bring them cool breezes, and spread the fragrance of flowers through the air, and send solace and healing. When we have tried for 300 years to do all the good we can, we shall receive an immortal soul and share in the everlasting happiness of mankind. You, poor little mermaid, have tried with your whole heart to do your same. By your sufferings and your courage in enduring them, you have raised yourself up into the spirits of air, and now you can gain an immortal soul by good deeds accomplished in the course of 300 years. The little mermaid raised her translucent arms towards God's sun, and for the first time she felt tears in her eyes. Noise and bustle had started again on the ship. She turned and saw the prince and his beautiful wife searching for her. Then they gazed with sorrow in their hearts at the bubbling foam, and they knew that she must have thrown herself into the waves. Invisible now, the little mermaid kissed the bride on her forehead and smiled at the prince, all anger forgotten, as she soared high with the other children of the air towards the rose-colored cloud floating through space. "In this way shall we float unto the heavenly kingdom in 300 years. We may even reach it sooner," whispered one of them. "Invisibly we float in the houses of human beings where there are children, and for every day on which we find a good child who brings joy to his parents and deserves their love, our time of probation is shortened by God. The child is unaware of it when we float through the room, and if we smile at him in our joy, 1 year is taken off the 300. But if we see a bad or naughty child, then we must weep tears of sorrow for him,
and every tear adds one day to our probation. The end. Thank you for joining me on this reading of The Little Mermaid. Next week, we'll be reading the story of two frogs.